Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment that changes everything, and it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like silence. It's the moment you don't send the message, don't explain yourself, don't reach out one last time to keep the peace. And what happens next will shock you. Because that silence doesn't end the connection, it exposes it. It reveals who is relying on your effort, who valued your presence, and who only stayed because you carried the emotional weight. Tonight, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you will understand why refusing to reach out again isn't loss. It's the moment you finally reclaim your power, your clarity, and yourself. When people talk about reaching out, they often frame it as love, maturity, or emotional intelligence. But in many cases, it is none of those things. It is anxiety wearing the mask of connection. It is the nervous system sounding an alarm, convinced that silence equals danger, distance equals rejection, and waiting equals loss. So you reach out not because you genuinely want to connect, but because you want relief. Relief from the tightness in your chest, the racing thoughts, the fear that if you don't act fast enough, you will be forgotten, replaced, or abandoned. In that moment, reaching out feels soothing, but what it actually does is reinforce the belief that you cannot feel okay on your own. Over time, this pattern becomes emotional conditioning. Your brain learns that discomfort is intolerable and that someone else must fix it. You start associating love with urgency, attachment with anxiety, and connection with self-abandonment. The message you send yourself, without realizing it, is that your emotional stability depends on another person's response. And once that belief takes root, you don't just reach out occasionally. You chase, you explain, you overgive, and you bend yourself into shapes that keep the bond intact at any cost. Not because you are weak, but because your system is trying to protect you from perceived loss. This is why stopping feels so frightening at first. When you don't reach out, your body reacts as if you are in danger. Your mind searches for reasons, justifications, and excuses to break the silence. But when you resist that urge, something powerful happens. You interrupt the conditioning. You teach your nervous system that discomfort is not a threat, and that connection does not require panic. In that pause, you begin reclaiming agency. You stop confusing anxiety for love, and you take the first step toward a calmer, more grounded sense of self that no longer depends on constant reassurance to feel secure. Once you begin to see that reaching out was driven by anxiety rather than genuine connection, silence takes on a completely different meaning. It no longer feels like punishment or withdrawal. It becomes a conscious choice. A line you draw not to control the other person, but to protect your own inner stability. Silence in this context is not about disappearing or playing games. It is about refusing to abandon yourself just to soothe discomfort. It is the moment you decide that your emotional well-being matters enough to be defended. At first, this kind of silence feels heavy. Your instincts scream that you should fix something, clarify something, soften the tension. You may feel guilty, selfish, or cold for not reaching out. But that guilt is not a moral signal. It is the residue of old conditioning. It is the part of you that learned that love meant effort without limits, and that peace was something you had to earn by sacrificing your needs. When you hold the boundary and stay quiet, you begin to separate true care from compulsive caretaking. This silence forces clarity in a way words never could. Without your constant reassurance, explanations, or emotional labor, the dynamic is stripped down to its truth. You start noticing how much of the connection depended on your initiative. You see whether the other person moves toward you on their own or remains still. And just as importantly, you start noticing yourself. You observe the waves of discomfort rise and fall, and you realize you are still okay. The anxiety does not destroy you, it passes. That realization is where power quietly returns. Not power over someone else, but power within yourself. You learn that boundaries are not walls. They are anchors. They keep you grounded when emotions try to pull you back into old patterns. By choosing silence as a boundary, you stop negotiating your worth through effort. You begin relating from choice instead of fear, and that shift changes everything that follows. As you stay anchored in that silence, another truth slowly comes into focus, one that can be uncomfortable to admit at first. You begin to see how much of the relationship was kept alive by your overfunctioning. You were the one initiating, conversations, smoothing over tension, anticipating needs, and carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be carried alone. What once felt like love or dedication starts to look more like a role you were performing to keep the connection from collapsing, not because you wanted control, but because you were afraid of what would happen if you stopped trying. Overfunctioning has a way of disguising itself as kindness. It tells you that if you just explain a little better, give a little more, or stay a little longer, things will improve. But in reality, it quietly trains the other person to do less. Your effort becomes the glue holding everything together, and the imbalance grows so slowly that you don't notice it happening. When you finally step back, it can feel like you are betraying the relationship, when in fact you are simply restoring balance that was never there to begin with. This is why silence feels so disruptive to the dynamic. When you stop overfunctioning, you remove the safety net that protected the other person from discomfort and responsibility. Suddenly, they have to sit with what you use to manage for them. The space you create doesn't just reveal their behavior, it reveals the structure of the relationship itself. You see clearly whether there was mutual effort or whether your energy was compensating for a lack of reciprocity. At the same time, you begin to reclaim energy that was drained by constant vigilance. You no longer scan for emotional shifts or measure your words to keep peace. That reclaimed energy starts flowing back into you, restoring a sense of wholeness you may not have felt in a long time. Overfunctioning fades, and in its place grows a quieter strength, one that does not need to prove its value through exhaustion. When you stop overfunctioning and step out of the role of emotional caretaker, you don't immediately feel strong. What you feel first is discomfort. Raw, unfamiliar, and unsettling. There is an urge to go back, to reinsert yourself, to relieve the tension by doing what you've always done. This is the moment where growth either deepens or collapses because discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is the signal that you're doing something new. For a long time, discomfort was something you avoided at all costs. You reached out to make it go away, to restore harmony, to feel safe again. But now you are sitting with it. You are allowing unanswered questions to exist without rushing to resolve them. You are tolerating uncertainty without demanding immediate reassurance. And in that space, your nervous system begins to learn a different lesson. You learn that discomfort does not equal danger. You learn that not knowing does not mean you are unloved. You learn that silence does not erase your value. Each time you stay present, instead of reacting, emotional maturity takes root. You begin responding to situations rather than being driven by them. Your sense of self becomes less reactive and more grounded. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly someone responds or how much effort you give. Instead, you start trusting your own internal signals. You notice what feels right and what feels draining. You notice where you used to override yourself just to keep connection alive. This tolerance of discomfort becomes a turning point. It builds self-trust in a way reassurance never could. You are proving to yourself, moment by moment, that you can handle emotional intensity without abandoning your boundaries. That strength doesn't announce itself loudly, it grows quietly, almost invisibly, but it changes how you show up everywhere. You become less available for chaos, less willing to chase clarity, and more comfortable letting truth reveal itself in time. And that comfort becomes the foundation for everything that follows. As you grow more comfortable sitting with uncertainty and trusting yourself, something external begins to happen that you can no longer ignore. The moment your effort truly stops the reality. Thank you of the relationship is exposed with startling clarity. Without your messages, your check-ins, your emotional maintenance, there is nothing left to hide behind. The connection either moves on its own or it doesn't. And this revelation doesn't take months. It happens quickly because imbalance cannot survive without constant compensation. What once felt confusing suddenly becomes obvious. You no longer need long conversations to understand where you stand. The absence of your effort acts like a spotlight, illuminating the truth that was always there but blurred by your overgiving. If the other person steps forward, initiates, and meets you in that space, it shows willingness and capacity. If they don't, it reveals that the relationship relied heavily on what you were providing, not on mutual investment. This clarity can be painful, especially if you hoped that your effort was being appreciated in ways you couldn't see. But pain in this moment is informative. It is clean and direct, not the slow confusion you lived in before. You stop negotiating reality. You stop interpreting silence, mixed signals, or inconsistency. Instead, you let behavior speak without interference. And in doing so, you regain authority over your emotional world. You are no longer trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment fueled by your own actions. You are simply observing what is. This shift restores dignity. It replaces anxiety with discernment. You stop asking why someone isn't showing up and start asking whether this dynamic aligns with who you are becoming. When effort disappears, truth takes its place. And while truth may sting at first, it also frees you. Because once you see clearly, you no longer waste energy trying to earn something that can only exist if it is offered freely and willingly. Once the truth is exposed, reactions begin to surface. And this is where understanding deepens even further. When you stop reaching out, people rarely respond with neutrality. Their response, or lack of it, becomes a mirror reflecting what the relationship was truly built on. Words may have been comforting in the past, but reactions are honest. They reveal motivations that explanations never could. Some respond with confusion, not because they miss you deeply, but because the familiar script has changed. They are unsettled by the loss of predictability. Others respond with anger or blame, framing your boundary as cruelty or abandonment. This reaction often comes from a sense of entitlement to your emotional labor. When that labor is withdrawn, it feels like a loss of power, and anger becomes the outlet. Some attempt manipulation, suddenly offering affection, apologies, or urgency that never appeared before. Not because insight arrived, but because access was threatened. Then there are those who perform indifference, acting as if nothing has changed. This is often a defense, a way to protect the ego from vulnerability. And finally, there are those who disappear entirely, confirming that their presence depended on your pursuit. Each response carries information. None of it is personal, even though it feels deeply personal. These reactions are not about your worth, they are about what your presence provided. As you observe instead of engaging, something shifts inside you. You stop arguing with reality. You stop explaining your needs to someone who benefits from misunderstanding them. You recognize patterns without excusing them. And that recognition creates emotional distance, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. This is where detachment becomes healthy. You are no longer trying to provoke care or extract effort. You are simply witnessing the truth of who someone is when you stop holding the connection together. And in that witnessing, you gain something invaluable. The ability to choose based on behavior, not hope. As you continue to witness these reactions without stepping in to manage them, a deeper shift begins to take place. The illusion of control that once surrounded the dynamic starts to unravel. Control was never loud or obvious, it was subtle, built on the assumption that you would always respond, always care, always try. When that assumption disappears, the structure holding everything together weakens, and insecurity rushes in to fill the gap. For the other person, this can be deeply destabilizing. Without your emotional cushioning, they are forced to face consequences they were previously shielded from. They feel the weight of their own behavior without your explanations softening it or your effort compensating for it. This is often when discomfort turns into agitation, defensiveness, or attempts to regain control, not because you changed, but because the environment did. The safety net is gone, and accountability is no longer optional. At the same time, something equally powerful is happening within you. By refusing to step back into your old role, you are reinforcing emotional discipline. You are teaching yourself that you do not need to react to every provocation or soothe every tension, that discipline dismantles the false belief that connection requires constant management. You begin to see how much of the control you thought the other person had was actually sustained by your participation. As their insecurity surfaces, your clarity strengthens. You stop absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry. You stop translating their reactions into self-doubt. Instead, you allow their behavior to stand on its own. This creates a quiet but undeniable shift in power, not over them, but within yourself. You are no longer reachable through guilt, urgency, or fear. When the illusion of control collapses, truth replaces it. And truth, while uncomfortable for some, is stabilizing for you. It confirms that your boundaries are not the problem. They are the catalyst that reveals what was hidden and restores your sense of self-respect. As truth replaces illusion and self-respect begins to stabilize within you, the focus slowly shifts from the other person back to yourself. This is where something deeply personal unfolds without the constant pull to manage, chase, or prove your value. Your identity starts to reorganize. For a long time, parts of who you were became tangled with what you provided. You were the listener, the fixer, the one who held things together. When that role dissolves, it can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you are actually losing is a version of you that survived through self-sacrifice. In the quiet that follows, you begin meeting yourself again. Not the reactive self, not the accommodating self, but the grounded one that exists when no one is demanding your energy. You notice your preferences more clearly. You become aware of how often you used to override your instincts. The inner voice that once felt faint grows stronger because it is no longer drowned out by urgency or fear. This is the slow rebuilding of identity, not through reinvention, but through remembrance. As self-trust returns, so does discernment. You no longer define yourself by how needed you are or how much you can endure. Your sense of worth becomes internal, steady, and less dependent on external response. Boundaries stop feeling like defenses and start feeling like expressions of who you are. You recognize the parts of yourself you compromised in order to keep relationships intact, and instead of judging yourself for that, you reclaim those parts with compassion. This rebuilding is quiet, but it is profound. It changes how you show up in every connection. You become less willing to abandon yourself and more willing to walk away from dynamics that require you to shrink. Identity, once built around effort, begins to root itself in self-respect. And from that place, you are no longer trying to hold on to connection. You are choosing it freely and consciously. As your identity becomes more rooted in self-respect, the emotional landscape around you begins to change in ways you didn't expect. What once felt like emptiness now feels different. The silence that used to trigger panic starts to feel spacious. The absence of constant communication no longer registers as loss, but as relief. You realize how much noise you were living with, how much emotional clutter came from managing connections that demanded more than they gave. This space allows your nervous system to finally exhale. Without the pressure to perform, explain, or anticipate, your mind slows down. You sleep better. You think more clearly. You notice moments of calm where there used to be tension. Strength emerges, not as hardness, but as steadiness. You are no longer bracing yourself for emotional swings or waiting for signs that everything is okay. You are okay regardless. In this newfound space, growth becomes possible. You start investing your energy where it can actually return to you. Hobbies resurface, friendships deepen. Your inner world expands beyond the narrow focus of keeping one dynamic alive. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of self-awareness. You understand what drains you and what nourishes you, and you begin choosing accordingly. This shift also changes what you tolerate. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or effort with love. You recognize that peace is not boring, it is healthy. And because you are no longer filling every gap with your own energy, you allow others to show up fully or not at all. Either way, you remain intact. What once felt like loss reveals itself as liberation. The space left behind is not empty, it is fertile. It becomes the ground where healthier relationships, clearer boundaries, and a stronger sense of self can grow. And in that space, you finally understand that letting go was never about giving up. It was about making room for something real. As you stand in that space of clarity and strength, the final understanding settles in with a quiet certainty. You begin to see relationships for what they truly are, not through hope or effort, but through balance. Real connection does not require one person to carry the weight while the other coasts. It does not survive on sacrifice alone. It lives on reciprocity, on mutual presence, on two people choosing each other without being chased, managed, or rescued. Looking back, you realize that what you once called love was often sustained by your willingness to overextend. You kept the connection alive through patience, forgiveness, and endless reaching. When you stopped, everything changed, and that change delivered the most honest answer you could have received. If something collapses the moment you rest, it was never built to support you in the first place. It was built on your endurance, not on shared commitment. This realization is not bitter. It is grounding. It frees you from romanticizing imbalance and from blaming yourself for not being enough. You were always enough. The structure simply required more than it could return. And once you understand that, you stop trying to revive what cannot sustain mutual growth. From this place, your standards shift naturally. You no longer seek connection that demands self-erasure. You look for relationships where effort flows both ways, where silence does not threaten stability, and where presence is not something you have to earn. You become more patient, not with dysfunction, but with the process of letting the right connections reveal themselves. In the end, refusing to reach out again was never about walking away from someone else. It was about returning to yourself. And what follows is not loss, but alignment. Alignment with who you are, what you need, and what real love actually looks like when it is no longer propped up by your exhaustion. So if you are standing at that edge right now, wondering whether staying silent means you are giving up or losing something important, let this be the moment you pause and breathe. Because what you are doing is not disappearing. You are choosing awareness over anxiety, self-respect over self-betrayal. You are allowing truth to surface without interference. And that truth, no matter how uncomfortable at first, is the only thing that can set you free. When you stop reaching out, you are not testing someone else. You are testing the foundation of the connection itself. And whatever remains after your effort is removed is what was always real. If someone steps forward, you see them clearly. If they don't, you finally stop living in uncertainty and start living in clarity. Either way, you win something priceless, peace. This journey is not instant, and it is not easy. There will be moments when your instincts pull you back toward old habits, when silence feels heavier than action. But each time you choose not to abandon yourself, you strengthen the part of you that knows your worth. You stop begging for reassurance and start trusting your own stability. You stop confusing effort with love and start recognizing reciprocity when it appears. And here is the truth that changes everything. The life you are building after this moment is calmer, cleaner, and more aligned than the one you were fighting to save. The space you created will not stay empty. It will fill with self-respect, emotional safety, and relationships that do not require you to shrink or struggle to be chosen. So stay here. Stay with the discomfort long enough to see what grows from it. Because what follows when you refuse to reach out again is not loneliness. It is strength. It is clarity. It is the return of yourself.